got the Chautauqua Trail and Bluebell.
Here we go, let's get into it. As they trudged up to that lake, the one that for so many of them would be their last stop, it would have been impossible to ignore the howling of the wind, the sharp bite to the air, colder than it should have been, and the already white mountaintops on the horizon. They had made a mistake, leaving when they did, trusting who they did, and now, odds were they'd be trapped here for a while. With dwindling food and hungry mouths to feed, some of them children, I wonder when those first rumblings, the desperate clawing for survival by any means, appeared in the mind of the collective Donner Party. I wonder which one of them considered it first. The stories of violence and hunger attached to the Donner Party, a group of 87 individuals who were stranded in the California mountains during an Oregon Trail migration in 1846, are widespread and well known. They left Missouri too late in the spring, trusted the word of the incapable Lansford Hastings, and after a failed shortcut that added 125 miles to their already long journey, found themselves stuck and cut off from their route by an unexpected blizzard. What followed were months of horror, of cold, of death, and, depending on who you believe, cannibalism. The first person to die was a man named Bayless Williams, who died of malnutrition. He would not be the last to die. Most of the other deaths belonged to men, who were allegedly exposing themselves to the elements and burning more calories than the women and children. Death did not pass over the rest of the group, however. The survivors' accounts paint a terrifying picture of what humans will do when pushed to the limit. Stories of native guides being killed for food, of children and infants perishing and becoming another shameful, sanity-destroying source of sustenance for those who remain, of the children themselves being the only ones to actually consume human flesh, their terrified and ashamed caregivers turning away from them with tears in their eyes and bile in their throats, of survivors being discovered among piles of severed limbs and bloody flesh. Of course, others from the party claimed no cannibalism occurred. It was just sensationalism. Maybe it's true. Or maybe they just don't want to acknowledge the terrible decisions they were forced to make by circumstances beyond anyone's control. No one was evil, at least not that history can tell. These were not survivalists, these were families, doing everything they could to make a better life for themselves in the way that so many did back then. The mountains, nature, they weren't evil either. They were just doing what nature does. When the survivors of the Donner tragedy tried to rejoin society after being rescued, many of them encountered prejudices and difficulties from the people around them, who knew nothing of the struggle that they had to endure and could only see them for what they had allegedly done. I wonder, when faced with accusation and misinformation, if the children or the widows thought to explain what it was really like, what it all looked like, what it felt like. Some probably did, I'm sure. There are historical records of it, but it doesn't matter too much, though. It would be impossible to truly explain something as primal and outside the expected comforts of modern living, even for the time, as what happened in that winter in 1846. It would be impossible to describe the desperation, because something you don't understand about nature until you're completely at its mercy is that there are no rules. You want to know another place that doesn't have any rules? The internet. Well, that's not exactly true, but take it from me. There are people out there who do anything that they want, stealing your personal information and making it publicly available for anyone to see. I used one of the many available people search sites to look up information about myself and was shocked how much was out there for anyone to find. Well, not anymore thanks to the sponsor of tonight's video, Aura. I've worked with Aura before, and in a time when scammers and advertisers are desperate for your personal information, you won't find a better defense. Aura can help remove your personal information from data brokers and people search sites that sell your information to scammers, identity thieves, and anyone else who wants it. Aura monitors your personal information, including social security number, across billions of data points, in places like the dark web and public court records to make sure that you're not the victim of identity theft or scams. Every adult on the account, up to 5 people, get $1 million in identity theft insurance to help cover eligible losses and fees up to a total of $5 million in protection. Do you even know how much that is? Those aren't the only reasons to download Aura. You also get access to a VPN, antivirus, and password manager, all with 24/7 support. With all those features, it's crazy you get it all in one affordable app. Don't let yourself get lost in the digital wilderness. Protect yourself by going to my link to get 2 weeks for free. That's right, free! That'll be plenty of time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data is exposed. Thanks again to Aura for helping support this video, as well as all the other videos that they've sponsored. And now, let's get back out there. I cannot see you at all. This makes everything behind you blind. Again, imagine me doing this without you here. There are lots of hiking trails in Colorado. That's just what happens when you live near the mountains. People want to walk on them. We're truly spoiled for choice out here, especially in places like Boulder. I'm in Chautauqua Park right now, a historic spot just a little ways away from the University of Colorado Boulder. It's one of my favorite trails in the area. Scenic, tree-covered, accessible, but it's certainly not the wilderness. If I started screaming for help right now, which I won't do, there's not a terrible chance that, at least after a couple minutes, if it was the right time of day, someone would come help me. Also, Jeremy's here, right behind the camera. But just a little further up the mountain, just a little deeper into the woods, it's not the same story. The place I'm in now is certainly impressive, but not as impressive as the mountains of Rocky Mountain National Park proper, a place which these mountains are technically a part of. Look at these views, these heights, how long these peaks go on for. It's gorgeous, obviously, but it's also a little intimidating. For all the beauty that it holds, there's still an ominous quality to the range. A fear of what might happen if you were stranded in a place like that. The cold, the hunger, the loneliness. I'm fascinated by this sensation, the shared experience of reverence and fear. It's like looking at an old god. In fact, many cultures talk about nature as though it is some kind of thinking being, a deity of incalculable size. Gaia, Mother Earth, Mother Nature. These are very friendly names for something that is definitively not your friend. In the modern era, with our heated homes and our supermarkets and our Wi-Fis and playboxes and X stations, we've lost our healthy fear of the wild. And the wild has also lost its healthy fear of us. One problem that comes from living near a hiking trail or national park is that sometimes the wildlife, for one reason or another, usually a food-based reason, decide to leave their environment and join ours. Little raccoon parades down the sidewalks, deer sniffing their way through neighborhood sidewalks, and occasionally a black bear or something like that rooting through a grocery store dumpster. It's what happens when humanity as a whole begins to push into an animal's natural habitat. The lines blur, and suddenly no one is where they belong. In the real wilderness, though, those lines are about as solid as they come. You are not supposed to be here, and the wildlife you encounter here will be a lot less friendly than a confused fox or a mama raccoon. But I don't want to talk about wildlife. Nice. Oh god, there's so much snow getting in here. I need to stop looking directly at the light, but it's also where my camera is, so let's just keep trucking. Let's keep trucking. Yeah. If you've been on the internet recently, like within the last year, you've probably heard a certain hypothetical going around, mostly aimed towards women, about whether or not they'd prefer being trapped in the woods with a bear or a man. This is a hypothetical that has become super controversial among certain groups, mostly men. And before I even get into that, let me acknowledge something. A bear is more powerful than a man. That's just an undeniable fact. They've got claws, jaws, and enough muscle to bring down anything that moves. If the question was, who would you rather face in a fist fight, then the answer of man would make infinitely more sense than bear. But that's not the question, and that's why so many women choose bear. Connor, you shout to me. Connor, why are you bringing up this argument? Aren't you a horror YouTuber? Isn't this a little too politically loaded for a video that's about the woods? And I hear you. I hear your whimpers, baby child. But to clarify, this video isn't just about the woods. It's about violence in the woods. And violence is a really interesting word, isn't it? Violence, when enacted by an animal, is more often than not a result of a biological necessity, either defensively or predatorily. Most times, people have been attacked by a bear, which happens less frequently than you might think. It's because they accidentally wandered too close to that bear's cubs, were actively engaging with the animal a la Timothy Treadwell, or were the unfortunate victim of predation, aka the bear was hungry. To the person being mauled, the why of it all probably doesn't matter, but let's extend the same analysis to a man. Violence from humans, and in this specific hypothetical, men, happen a lot more frequently than bear attacks. And that's reason number one why women are choosing the bear. Statistically, if they give that bear enough room, they'll probably be fine. The same is not a guarantee for humans. But again, we're putting too much focus on the bear part. It's not about how friendly the bear can be, it's about how unfriendly a person, a man, can be. Human violence is special. In a video that came out 7 months ago from the date I wrote this script, proving how behind I am on conversations like this, Funky Frogbait, a super talented commentary YouTuber and essayist, made this point. Choosing the bear over the man comes down to a very logical comparison of possible outcomes. The bear is an animal, operating off of instinct. If it responds with aggression, it's doing so either to defend or feed itself. A man, however, is capable of prolonged, excruciating, and degrading forms of torture, requiring a level of creativity and hatred that an animal simply could not comprehend. The man understands your screams for help, knows what he's doing is wrong, but continues anyway, not out of necessity, but pleasure. This quote, though I've presented it without the context of the full video, is not an indictment of the male gender as a whole. It's not claiming that every man you pass on the street as a woman wants to do terrible things to you. What it is a coherent and evocative explanation of the types of violence that these different creatures, bears and men, are capable of, and how much of the associated fear is psychological and not just based on anecdotal Ursine horror scenarios. As Funky Frogbait goes on to explain, it's a roll of the dice anytime a woman interacts with a man. Not all men are violent or aggressive, sure, but when you've been exposed to so much violence from men, it becomes harder to trust that toss-up. And women are very specifically exposed to this kind of violence all the time, if not personally, then through their peers and loved ones, or at least popular media. Women know it, and so do men, even if they're uncomfortable admitting it. In reality, you're much more likely to be hurt by another person than a bear. This has plenty to do with the fact that most of us don't live in mauling range of most bears, but it also has to do with the fact that humans have an insanely high capacity for violence, even when in a controlled environment. Most victims of assault or sexual violence are attacked by someone they know rather than a stranger, for the sole reason that it's much easier to abuse a pre-existing relationship than to target an unknown person. And this happens in cities, in schools and churches, in your house or your family's house or your friend's house. These are places that, especially in our modern era, are full of security cameras, recording devices, phones, even witnesses, and the violence still happens. So imagine what it would be like dealing with that in the woods. No witnesses, no one to call for, nothing stopping anyone from doing whatever they want to you other than their own power and their willingness to inflict it on others. It doesn't have to be a man, but can't you see how scary it would be if it was? Now, this is a very serious topic of conversation that I think should continue to be discussed, both in how women have very clearly and somewhat universally expressed their fear and distrust, as well as in how men, not all men, but a lot of the loud ones, have responded to this hypothetical. Go watch Funky's video after mine. They do a much better explanation and analysis of this idea. Before we start talking about how fiction utilizes these violent fears and creatively draws its audience into that primal state of mind, it's important that you understand exactly what I mean when I say there are no rules in the wilderness and why that's so terrifying. Now let's talk about Yellowjackets. Okay, yeah, if you want to walk away now. Yeah, I'll just yell out a little bit when I'm done. How do you describe the show Yellowjackets to someone who's never seen it in a way that captures all that it really is? Is it about the nature of love, relationships, and responsibility? Is it a show about the trauma of enduring horrible circumstances with people you care about? Is it a show about cannibalism? About mental illness? Hot moms? Lesbianism? Well, yes. It's all of those things. But at its simplest, Yellowjackets is a show about a group of girls and a couple of guys surviving for a year and a half in the Canadian wilderness. And it's awesome. It is so cold out here. Yellowjackets' story is split up into two distinct time periods. The time the girls were in the woods and everything that happened after they were rescued. We swap back and forth between these timelines, but both of them are presented linearly. This creates a narrative that can show you first an adult version of a character doing something or responding to something in a way that would be odd for someone under normal circumstances, and then it can cut back to that character's time as a teenager in the woods and what motivated their strange behavior later on. This narrative structure is a valuable tool to introduce you to how traumatic the girls' experiences all were without having to overtly tell you what exactly happened before the moment is right. There are a few things that we know off the bat. That people died, some of them probably at the hands of their friends. That there's something the survivors are trying to hide from the world, and most likely, it's that they ate each other. Other than that, though, we're in the dark. What makes Yellowjackets so compelling, beyond just the survival narrative, are the characters and the work done to make them distinct and compelling. There are definitively sapphic themes, let's go lesbians, that a large amount of the fan base is rather invested in. The relationships, especially the romantic ones, that exist between characters are complex and nuanced, affected further by the stressful situation at hand. My favorite part of Yellowjackets is the way that the show keeps you in the dark. There's a vague supernatural element to the show, specifically in the time period where we focus on the girls in the woods, except I don't really know if that's true. Oh my god, I need to stand up. Oh my god. You do not all know what I put up with for this channel. Oh my god, I just kicked dirt all up into my computer. God damn it. After a certain length of time surviving in the wilderness, the girls start believing that Lottie Matthews, one of their fellow survivors, is somehow capable of interpreting the wants and needs of the wilderness itself, like it's an ancient god in need of reverence or sacrifice. There are plenty of moments in the show where it seems like the world is rewarding or punishing the survivors for their actions, either allowing them to find food or shelter in the face of extreme danger, or getting them actually killed when they don't follow the rituals that they have all arbitrarily come up with. Strange things happen with seemingly no reason enough that a group of girls begin to worship Lottie, to the dismay of the more rational and grounded survivors. After a certain point, though, those just don't exist anymore. After long enough in the violent, cold, unfeeling wilderness, there's no more room to be a rational person. The fascinating part is that, save for a few specific odd moments, most action scenes can be explained logically or by coincidence. It's really hard to say whether or not something was actually out there with them, to the degree that they still don't know years later, looking back at it through the eyes of an adult. The interesting thing is how social order falls apart with each major character death. The show starts with a plane crash that results in the death of the actual team coach, signifying a loss of traditional authority in the face of a survival scenario. Later, a survivor named Laura Lee, who is deeply Christian, dies in a freak plane explosion trying to escape, which not only reinforces the girls' belief that something wants them to stay in the woods, but also represents the death of traditional religion. Later, Jackie, a hugely important character to what I would consider our main protagonist Shauna, dies out in the cold after an argument, representing the death of modern civility, as she was sort of a team leader who could not extricate herself from her modern ideals and social sensibilities, as well as the death of Shauna's last connection to the world and potentially her capacity for true love. Her death directly results in the girls completely giving into their primal instincts as, starving in the winter, they eat her. And finally, the first life we see the girls take intentionally, a younger boy who goes out of his way to save the intended victim, my favorite character Natalie, represents the death of innocence, as now no one can claim they were a bystander to their own violence. They are all responsible now, but only because of the situation. When we jump back to the modern timeline, with these girls now women with jobs and families and addictions, it's very clear to the audience how badly everyone wants to just go back to normal and pretend that what happened to them didn't happen. Part of that is clearly just trauma, but the other part is shame. Because sure, a lot of what they did was purely out of survival, but was all of it? We're only 2 seasons into the show, with the 3rd season arriving next month, and we haven't seen all of what happened in the woods yet. Already, the girls have done some intense and terrifying shit, and there are still months and months for things to get worse. Probably a lot worse. One of the most interesting plot points, in my opinion, is the fact that Misty, by far the craziest and most unhinged of all the characters in the show, intentionally smashed up the black box after the plane crash, electing not to be rescued, simply because she was so excited by how much the girls needed her, with her expertise in survival and healthcare. She was clearly not well liked back in her normal life, and sees this new environment as a chance to redefine herself in the eyes of her peers. Everything that follows is partially the fault of Misty, even though plenty of it happens at the hands of the others, who for all their posturing are maybe just as bad as her. They're tired, hungry, cold, afraid, and desperate. But they're also, in a strange way, free. Free to do whatever they want with zero consequences. There are no rules in the wilderness. Okay, Jay, you're good. Oh my God, my producer, my Jeremy producer, ran off so he wouldn't get spoilers for Yellowjackets. And now he's being quiet in the dark and I don't know where he is. I'm alone in the wilderness. Jeremy! Okay. I was 50% sure that you were fucking with me and you were about to jump out of the darkness. We're done with spoilers. No more Yellowjacket talk. We're done with spoilers. A lot of survival stories begin with a plane crash because it's hard to explain how someone could end up in a true survival situation otherwise. There are a lot of people on the planet, so when you're telling a stranded story, especially one that exists during modern times, you have to go pretty far out of your way to explain how someone could end up stranded in one of the few places where people are not, or at least where they're not normal. The Forest, a game released in 2014, is a perfect example of this. As mentioned, The Forest begins with a plane crash. You play as a man named Eric LeBlanc, who's traveling with his son Timmy when the plane goes down in a fictional place known only as the Peninsula. Directly after the crash, while you're incapacitated, Timmy is taken from you by something. The horror of the forest, though it shares similarities, is a very different kind of horror than the one presented in Yellowjackets. Both stories do have to do with surviving the natural elements and cannibalism, obviously, but where Yellowjackets made one of the threats the people around you, the fellow survivors, in the forest, your enemies are much more alien and intimidating. You didn't crash with them, you crashed into them. There's a tribe of indigenous people living in a place called North Sentinel Island, India, who are called the Sentinelese. You might be familiar with them, especially if you were paying attention to the news in 2018. They are a hugely isolated group who are well documented as being aggressive and violent towards outsiders of the tribe, even Indian officials. It is for this reason that people are strongly dissuaded from visiting North Sentinel Island, and that those who make the journey are often arrested. There are just some places that are better left alone, and the island is a perfect example of that, with its many warnings and stories. However, to someone like John Allen Chow, the warnings don't mean much. I probably don't have to finish this story for you, but I will anyway. John Allen Chow was an explorer and missionary with the Kansas City church known as All Nations, an evangelical organization trying to spread the message of Jesus Christ to the whole world. In 2018, after being part of other missions to Mexico, South Africa, and Kurdistan, John decided, after having expressed an interest in bringing his religion to the Sentinelese, that he would make his way, illegally I should add, to North Sentinel Island. He visited multiple times, after paying 2 fishermen to ferry him there. Those fishermen would later be arrested. Every time John went, he was met with aggression, threats, and even bewilderment from the people there for his many attempts to purge Satan from their community. Surprising no one, the last time that John visited, he did not return. The fishermen who brought him to the island reported seeing members of the tribe dragging his body along the beach and later burying it on the shore. It's reported that John was killed with a bow and arrow, though despite a few attempts, his body was never recovered. Now, I'm not here to talk about the ethics and morality of a completely isolated and culturally distinct tribe on the other side of the world. There are historians, theologians, and anthropologists that can and have covered these types of stories with much more insight and valuable information than a stupid horror writer like myself would be capable of. All I mean to illustrate by referencing this story, one that's not even completely unique historically, is the danger of ending up in a place, especially one so different from your standard setting, where you are absolutely and unequivocally not welcome. John's story is tragic, but the result of either stubbornness or ignorance. It's not like there were no warning signs. Eric, to return to the fictional setting of the forest, did not actively make the choice to become hunted by a group of mutated cannibals, which, just to clarify, I'm not comparing to the actual Sentinelese. Instead, he was forced into the situation by, gravity-based means. One of the most exciting parts about playing the forest is the enemy AI. It goes beyond just avoiding your attacks and landing them yourselves. No, the enemies in the forest are a communicative unit. Before you're attacked by a large group, you're usually going to encounter scouts, and depending on how you deal with those scouts, either by running from them, fighting back, or even killing them, the way the rest of the island starts treating you changes. If you're real brutal with it, chopping them up and setting up these horrific body part effigies, the cannibals will be more cautious around you, scared of what you're capable of. Meanwhile, if you constantly run from them, scrambling for safety whenever an encounter begins, they don't see you as a threat and throw more and more at you until there's nothing you can do. The forest, if you couldn't tell from the footage, is a survival game. You're building shelters, hunting and trapping animals, and just doing everything you can to survive long enough to find your son and rescue him. You're dealing with all the things the girls in Yellowjackets had to deal with on top of external enemies, who at first appear to be just more primal humans, but are later revealed to be so much more terrifying. But more horrifying than anything, at least conceptually, if not in presentation, is how alone you are. Depending on how much of a gamer you are, you spend days, maybe months, completely isolated save for marauding cannibals. From the comfort of your own home, simply playing a video game, it doesn't mean much more than it does in a game like Minecraft single player. But imagine actually being Eric, starving, under siege, dealing with the elements, probably with intense PTSD, and worried for the safety of his son, with no one to relieve the tension. At least in Yellowjackets, the girls had each other, when they weren't busy randomly choosing ritual sacrifices, but here, Eric has nothing. Imagine what that would feel like. Being alone, having to be completely responsible for yourself, doing whatever it takes just to survive. It would change you. You'd have to learn to follow the rules of the wilderness, but of course, as mentioned, there are no rules in the wilderness. Except sometimes there are. We're in a new filming location. Don't worry about it. Sometimes there are, especially if it's a national park. Firewatch is a very different experience from the two that I just mentioned. For one thing, it's not a horror story, not really. There are moments of tension and mystery in the game, but throughout your playthrough, you're not really going to feel scared. You're just kind of going to feel sad. Firewatch is a game by the developer Campo Santo that takes place in the real-world Shoshone National Forest, Wyoming. In it, you play as Henry, a new hire for the National Forest Service, and most of your actual gameplay involves simply walking around the park, trying to prevent forest fires, and as the game goes on, solving the mystery of who's been secretly observing and interacting with you and your only real human connection, a woman named Delilah that you never meet in real life and only speak to via radio. It's a beautiful game, with simplified graphics that make it timeless in its quality, but its real beauty has to do with its narrative. Your character, Henry, actually used to live right here in Boulder, where he met his wife, Julia. They met in a bar on Pearl Street. They had a couple good years together before Julia started becoming more confused and irritable, incapable of continuing the work she had spent so much time devoting herself to. Eventually, you found out she had early onset Alzheimer's. Henry did his best to be there for her and to take care of her, but at a certain point, there was nothing he could do. She went back home to Australia to live with her parents. And unable to deal with this situation, Henry ran to Wyoming to take the new Firewatch job. This is not a secret. The game tells you this outright. Henry is not a perfect person. The game gives you the option to decide exactly how unhealthy or stubborn he is through mainly dialogue choices, but no matter what, he's clearly someone with a lot of baggage, who becomes easily frustrated, who makes selfish choices when pushed to them. He's not a bad guy, he's just human. One dealing with something really hard, and not super healthily. The quiet of nature is too much to endure alone for months, and so Delilah, this faceless voice on the radio, becomes one of the most important connections to reality Henry has. Very quickly, it becomes clear that pretty much everyone who makes the choice to isolate themselves out here, Firewatch Ranger or otherwise, has something they're hiding, or running from. We already know what it is for Henry, but what is it for Delilah? There's talk of an ex, but they might still be together, not physically of course, but despite their pre-existing and hypothetical romantic relationships, Henry and Delilah become way closer than expected. There is a shaky romantic tension between them as the days begin to pass and Henry grows accustomed to life out in the woods. You know Henry has a wife as he falls into these intimate conversations with Delilah, but at the same time, you also know he's hurting and desperate for tenderness, support, just anyone. For a while, that's really the only complicating factor you have to deal with during your time out here. That you have someone you love who is losing themselves on the other side of the world, and you're here with Delilah. It would be enough to be a compelling story by itself, but eventually you realize that someone's been listening to your conversations and recording them. Things sort of spiral from here. Both Henry and Delilah suddenly horrified by the realization that all of their conversations that they had thought were private were not, and could potentially even be used against them. Not just their late-night drunken chats that dip more heavily into romantic topics, but also the random operational failures that they've both been a part of, that could lose them their jobs or even get them arrested. As tensions begin to grow, so does a fire on the horizon of the forest. With each new revelation about the park, the fire grows until finally you realize what has actually happened just as the entire park is burning down around you. Over the course of the game, you start hearing stories of this character, Ned Goodwin, and his son, Brian. He was apparently the former Firewatch guard at the tower you work at, the Twin Forks Lookout. Delilah was close with Brian, but disliked Ned. At a certain point, she lost connection with both of them and doesn't know what happened. You took Ned's job the next summer. Over the course of the game, you have more strange encounters with the person observing you. You start to realize that whatever is happening, it has to do with a locked cave near your tower. Eventually, you find the key for it and realize the truth. At some point, Brian was climbing in a cave with his dad when his rope became disconnected from its anchor point, and he fell. You find his body, mangled, decomposing, and partially crushed at the bottom of a long drop. Brian died here, and his dad never left. The person observing you has been Ned, who, after watching his son die, an event he claims no responsibility for, realized that what came next would be having to tell people, having the body removed, having a funeral, having to return to a normal life without his son, and the knowledge that he, even if he didn't kill him, couldn't save the person who mattered most to him. And so he decided to stay. He made sure the cave was left locked, set up radio equipment to monitor rangers and avoid detection, and camped out in the national forest for years. When you finally find his hideout, he's not there. He knew you were coming and goes even deeper into the woods. Henry, Delilah, and Ned were all running from things that they didn't want to acknowledge. I recently made a video about this exact dangerous choice. When Henry and Delilah find out about Brian, something changes in them. Delilah decides she has to take care of whatever it is she's running from, probably a partner named Javier, and Henry, at least in my playthrough, decides it's time to go be with his wife, even if she doesn't recognize him, and her family dislikes him, and it all hurts him so bad. For all the beauty of the Shoshone, it's truly a forest of pain. Henry and Delilah realize this, and in tandem with the fire rescue, escape the draw to become even more lost in it. But Ned just dives further. It's too late for him. He can't go back to being another sad, angry father, mourning in public, drinking and hating the world. He'd rather just be an animal, free of observation, free of restraint, experiencing the terrible freedom of his own self-destruction out in the woods. Because there's no rules in the wilderness. Have you ever heard of a place called Burkittsville, Maryland? It's home of the Black Hills Forest, a forest which many of the current-day residents of Burkittsville have a lot to say about. Back in the day, a bunch of children, 7 specifically, went missing from the town into that forest at the hands of a murderer named Rustin Parr. Rustin believed he'd been influenced to commit these horrible crimes by some sort of witch. If you're not familiar with Burkittsville, then maybe you'll recognize it by its original name, Blair. The Blair Witch Project is a monumental piece of horror history, for its controversial ending, for the way it pioneered the found footage genre, and specifically, the incredibly iconic shots and lines which continue to be referenced by horror and non-horror projects alike to this very day. The story follows 3 amateur filmmakers creating a documentary on the legend of the eponymous Blair Witch. Heather, the main person behind the effort, and Mike and Josh, audio and camera guys. The majority of the film is simply these 3, and after a certain point, 2, navigating the Black Hills Forest. First as a way to film important historical sites, but later because they can't escape. Something that always stands out to me on rewatches of the film is the fact that there's a clear moment when all is lost and the group have no hope of escaping, but they don't even recognize it at the time. And in fact, you probably don't on your first watch. There's this shot after the group has driven up to the tree line of the forest where the camera, held by one of the filmmakers, lingers on their car as they get further and further away from it, starting their first day in the woods. There's a little water bottle on top of the car. The moment that shot cuts to the next, the 3 of them now actually walking through the woods, it's over. They're in the trap now, and it's not a trap you can get out of. The best part, though? They have no idea. Things remain pretty casual for a while before things start to break down between the group members. The Blair Witch Project is a perfect example of the McGrath's Corner theory I came up with early last year. That idea of not showing something being scarier than showing it. To the dismay of many horror fans, we never actually see the Blair Witch in the movie, only the results of her power. The biggest trick that the witch pulls in the movie is her manipulation of reality, specifically the layout of the woods. After a certain point in their process, the 3 filmmakers began having a lot of trouble navigating the woods using the map and compass that they've brought with them. Things stop appearing where they're supposed to, the map becomes more and more useless, and walking for 8 hours in one direction just lands the group back where they started. Obviously, this would be horrifying if you recognized it as supernatural, but instead of jumping to that conclusion, the group begins fighting among themselves, blaming each other for how much time they've spent lost in the woods, calling each other incompetent or malicious. They really do try to maintain civility, but in the face of how lost they are, it's hard to maintain control, which is, I think, exactly what the Blair Witch wants. There are a couple times when the protagonists discover things that the witch has left in the woods, seemingly for them specifically. One morning after a night of strange noises, the group wakes to find small stone piles have been formed around their campsite. There's nothing inherently horrifying about these stone piles, other than that they conjure the image of an unknown figure skulking about and setting them up, just a few steps away from the place where everyone was asleep and unaware. It paints a picture of the witch as being more than just a killer, because if that were the case, wouldn't she just kill them where they lay? No, she's got more for them to deal with. Maybe she can't really do anything to them until they're in her house, but I prefer to think of it as her simply screwing with the party. Totally capable, but enjoying their fear. Later, the group stumbles upon a bunch of these hanging stick figure idols, and have no idea what they mean or how to feel about them. These idols have become one of the most popular symbols attached to the movie. In research for this essay, and also for B-roll, I played the 2019 Blair Witch game by Bloober Team, the same team responsible for the recent Silent Hill 2 remake, which I really enjoyed. I thought it was fun, but I have to acknowledge that for a Blair Witch game, it misses a lot of the subtlety of that first film, in the ways that the other 2 Blair Witch movie entries have managed to do themselves. If it were called something else, it might have gotten a better reception, but I digress. The actual forest of the game feels realistic and strange in the ways you'd hope a Blair Witch game would be, but the part that I actually find compelling is the way it presents the interior of the house. If you don't remember, but honestly, how could you not? The Blair Witch Project ends very suddenly. After one of their friends goes missing, Heather and Mike follow Josh's screams to a house in the middle of nowhere, where, in a confusing final sequence, they are both killed, probably, by either the witch or each other at the witch's behest. The film ends with the terrifying and iconic shot of what looks like Josh standing in the corner in quite the same way that was described by the locals for the missing children back in the day, before the camera goes crashing to the ground as Mike is attacked by something and we cut to black. Depending on who you ask, there's a psychological background to all of the witch's actions, and her powers extend to the walls of this final house in the same way they do for the rest of the forest, that being the ability to manipulate and change the environment. In the Blair Witch game, PTSD has a lot to do with the narrative, and when you finally reach the house, you spend a lot more time there in tense scenes avoiding strange creatures, being taunted by female voices that may or may not belong to a witch, and having to avoid making eye contact with entities that I'm not sure how to classify. What's interesting is how, at least in this version, the witch is so much more willing to use pre-existing trauma against the protagonist instead of simply breaking them down through slow, survival-based circumstances. It made the horror more human, but unfortunately less Blair Witch. Like I said, if the game was fully independent from the movie and just shared some similarities, I think it would have been more appreciated, but it was being judged in comparison to a pop culture piece that it had no chance of outshining. Before moving to our conclusion, I should also point out that in a strange similarity to Yellowjackets, there are certain theorists and fans of the movie who believe that there is no supernatural element to the movie, just a strange legend, an incompetent navigator, and two men who got fed up with it. The theory goes that after being dragged around so much by Heather, who fails to acknowledge any responsibility for getting the team lost, the other two began to mess with her and get under her skin before their interaction came to a head, and they killed her in the final house. I think in the face of a few certain scenes in the movie, it's unlikely, but either way, those three learned their lesson. Whether or not they were trapped there by supernatural forces, it doesn't matter. You don't dive headfirst into the woods, especially if you've never been there, because it's not going to forgive you for your boldness. It's not going to respect your intention. It's just going to sit there and wait for something to happen to you. Uncaring, unthinking, unrestrained. There are no rules in the wilderness. Earlier last year, I narrated a short horror story by the author Leslie J. Hartman called Loved, and I thought I would talk about it for the conclusion of this video. The main character of the story is someone who grew up thinking nature was their friend, that they were on the same page and respected each other mutually. There are a lot of people in real life who believe things like this, with various different experiences to back up their beliefs. Nature is beautiful, it can be serene, and yes, it even can provide, under the right circumstances. And so we've convinced ourselves it's a benevolent, friendly force. But as the main character in Loved went on to discover, as did the protagonists and real people from all the stories we covered tonight, just because you like something or feel connected to it doesn't mean you have to be a part of it. You're guaranteed nothing in the wild. Not safety, not adventure, not rescue, nothing. But all things considered, is it safer, if you're gonna go, to journey into the forest alone, with no one to help you, or with someone else? You might think it's safer with others, but how much can you trust a person in a place like that? Even if you know them, even if you trust them, you'll never be able to get past the fact that there are no rules in the wilderness. Thanks for watching. Oh my God, okay, thank God we're done. Oh my God, it's so cold. Oh my God. I just need to get the blood moving in my feet specifically. My toes are getting chilly. But it's still picking up my mic audio too, so I can hear all my breath. This video. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I know that there were some audio issues halfway through the video, and if you made it to the end, again, I really appreciate you sticking through it. I'm working with new technology here, and I promise I'm going to get better with it. I want to give a special shout out to my buddy Jeremy for driving me out into the woods and then helping me film there at 5 in the morning. That's a crazy thing to do for free because he did it for free. Special shout out to Joe. He helped work on the thumbnail for this video, and he's always been great with thumbnails, so I'm always happy to have him working on stuff for me. Happy 2025, everyone. It's been great to see you here. Please consider becoming a member. Please consider buying some merch. Both of those help me in ways you don't even understand, and I promise that I've got some really great stuff in the works right now. Magnus Protocol and Ethan Winters are in progress. We will get follow-up videos for both of those. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Have a great night, boneheads.